All right, so we kind of got to get to the bottom of this. I mean, we're talking about plants potentially being toxic. I mean, I'm going to ask the gut health doctor, Dr. Will Bulsiewics himself, like, are plants poisonous?
Oh, they're incredibly poisonous, but then, like, not really.
Okay, so what do you mean by this? Okay, so when you look at a poisonous plant, I mean, in theory, it seems like you're eating something that doesn't want to be eaten, and therefore it's going to have this cascade of issues inside your body. I mean, what exactly is happening there?
Well, we're talking about anti-nutrients, and there's a number of different, specific anti-nutrients that we could dig into that exist as a part of the plant and serve a purpose for the plant. Like oxalic acid, which are how we form the oxalates. Like, that's a part of all plants, all mammals, by the way. Like, we actually produce our own oxalates. Most people don't realize that. And why do plants produce oxalic acid or have oxalates in the first place? Part of it we think is sun exposure. So there seems to be something about the plants and the animals that like require sun exposure in order to be healthy. This seems to be one of the compounds that's part of it. But there's a number of different things. Perhaps it's to stop insects from consuming them. Now, like, we are not insects. We are completely different. And when we consume these foods that may contain oxalates, and I'm happy to get into each of these, oxalates, lectins, phytates or phytic acid, when we consume those, when we consume them in moderation and not to excess, actually they're beneficial to our health.
Special link down below for 20% off of these suckers, macadamia nuts from House of Macadamia. But it's not just 20% off. There's also a free box of Namibian sea salt macadamia nuts. That's literally a free entire box with whatever your purchase is. So the cool thing about House of Macadamia is specifically their bars. So their bars, the first ingredient is macadamia nuts. I challenge you, if you go to like any grocery store, look at the macadamia nut bars, and it might have macadamia nuts somewhere in the ingredient list, but these are legit. The first ingredient, we're talking like 45% macadamia nuts. We're talking keto friendly, low carb, also vegan if that's what you're into. The whole thing is amazing, and they're harvested in South Africa. The proceeds benefit the farmers. The farmers have ownership in the company. They're taking the world by storm. That's why you're seeing them on Joe Rogan. That's why you're seeing them on Tim Ferriss. They're everywhere. But that special link down below is a 20% off discount link exclusively for people that watch my video. So it's a special link and a special offer. So you got to use that link, and then you add the macadamia nuts to your cart, and they will get taken off when you check out. So that's how it works, just to make sure you can take advantage of the offer. So check that link out down below in the description. Yeah, I think that's the operative word too. I mean, you said, not in excess, right? And I think that might have a level of bi-individuality. Maybe there's some people tolerate more than less, whatever, but either way, let's kind of talk about them specifically, because I think people might put a blanket, anti-nutrient term over a lot of these things. And if you really get down to the granular, there's very few people that actually know the mechanisms and know what's actually happening enough to be able to take a solid stance. They just, we are tribal creatures. We tend to like to subscribe to a way of thinking. And sometimes, I myself have had to kind of turn corners with this too and understand that, hey, I need to actually understand what phytic acid is. I need to understand what it does inside a mammal's body. And with that, I'll kind of turn it to you. I mean, can we kind of break them down? Like, let's start with phytic acid, because I think that's one of the more popular ones that people know about.
Yeah. So phytic acid classically found in seeds, nuts, legumes. And so phytic acid is like, the concern is that it could bind up minerals and make it so that you don't get access to those minerals. But yet, people who consume diets that are high in phytic acid, do we discover that they have these nutritional deficiencies, that they are more prone to having some sort of mineral deficiency as a result of their phytic acid intake? The answer is no. I haven't seen any evidence that convinces me that that is in fact the case when you are eating a balanced diet. And the reason why is because those foods that contain phytic acid, guess what? They also contain minerals, and many times more amounts of those minerals. And so as a result of that, the phytic acid and the minerals, they're just in balance. But it's also important for people to keep in mind that these plants are not just vehicles to deliver phytic acid. They contain a number of different things that are in there. Fiber and phytochemicals and polyphenols. And these things all are mixed together and having a unique effect on our body. So looking at phytic acid in a test tube or in an animal model in isolation is not the same as me eating a handful of nuts. It's not even close. So we have to ultimately look at the data of like what happens in humans when they consume foods that contain phytic acid. And what we see in humans when they consume foods that contain phytic acid is they tend to live longer with less disease. And when you dig into the details of like, what's going on there, what we think at this point is that phytic acid actually has a number of unique benefits. So it seems to be anti-inflammatory, antioxidant, so it reduces oxidative stress in the body. This appears to be the reason why like phytic acid shouldn't necessarily be something that we're scared of. Now, that being said, like there are strategies that you can use to reduce the phytic acid content in your food. One of them is to ferment it. So like if you take flour and you ferment it and you create sourdough, it's substantially lower in both phytic acid and also gluten content. Another way is to soak. You can soak your legumes or soak your seeds and nuts. And by soaking them, you actually are removing the phytic acid in the process of doing that.
Interesting. Yeah, I think, and people, you said something that was very important there, Sid, when you eat a balanced diet. Let's pretend for a second that, you ate something that was high in phytic acid. Let's pretend for a second that is going to completely chelate, lock up all the minerals that they cannot be absorbed. If that were the case, and that was happening in a snapshot in time, I know enough about nutrition to know that the effect of everything else that you're eating can vastly supersede that and sort of balance out that effect or counterbalance it even more, right?
Yeah.
So if you were only eating cashews or only eating nuts as your source of nutrition, then perhaps you could make that argument that, yes, the X percentage of the minerals that you're consuming might be bound up. But if you're eating a wide array of foods, then that becomes a moot point because as a sort of percentage of what you're taking in, it's not like you have this much phytic acid and it's going to lock up all the minerals from this much food.
Yeah, well, and also you have one meal that happens to be like excessively high in phytic acid. And let's pretend that hypothetically that one meal does actually deplete your body of some of these minerals. Let's pretend it does. Guess what's going to happen? You're going to eat another meal.
Yeah.
And most likely, if you're eating a balanced diet, it's not going to continue to be some sort of arrangement, and this is like completely theoretical, but it's not going to continue to be some sort of arrangement that depletes your body of these minerals. So, again, what I come back to is, first of all, where is the evidence that people who eat a high phytic acid diet are actually nutritional deplete or are suffering from mineral deficiencies? I haven't seen that.
Okay, so let's jump over, there's obviously the big elephant in the room that people like to address, and that's the world of lectins.
Yeah.
I am a fan of a modified, people always ask, like, what style do I eat? I eat what I call a modified Mediterranean diet because I eat a fair bit of protein. So I take a Mediterranean diet and I do increase the protein intake because of my specific goals. So for the most part, my carbohydrate sources are going to be things like lentils, a fair bit of legumes, fruits, veggies. That's really my carbohydrate source. And then, a fair bit of lean proteins, usually opt for leaner cuts. So that's my diet in a nutshell, and a fair bit of like kefir and cottage cheese and stuff like that.
Nice.
Point is that I come under fire a lot, specifically because of the lentils and things like that. Okay, if you're talking lectins, Thomas, like, is that going to really destroy you? And I had to stop and think, like, okay, should I just eliminate the legumes and all the lentils? Bottom line is, I've never had any issue with it.
Yeah.
And as far as lectins are concerned, that's a very hot button issue. What's sort of the stance there?
Yeah. So I want to walk through this because there's a couple things that are really important for people to understand. First of all, lectins are ubiquitous in nature, meaning that all living creatures, including plants, including humans, including me and you and the people that are listening to us, including the microbes that are a part of our body, they all produce lectins. These are like signaling molecules that exist in nature, and they play a relevant role. Now, the evidence that lectins cause trouble for humans comes in two forms. And I just want to debunk these two forms of evidence. The first is that comes from test tube studies, where you take some inordinate concentration of lectins in isolation and then you apply it to like some cells that you swirl around in a little slurry, that is not the same as you and I consuming lentils. It's not even close. So we have to be very careful about translating a test tube study and accepting that as gospel. And when we consume lentils, it's not just lectins. It's lectins on a minor level, which is going to be my second point, but also with fiber and polyphenols and resistant starches and minerals and vitamins and all these other wonderful things that are really good for us. Okay, the second point is that when I mentioned there's two pieces of evidence that lectins are problematic. The second one has to do when people consume undercooked food. Because if you take like the main place where lectins exist in plants are legumes. And if you take, kidney beans and you don't adequately cook them, then they will be higher in lectins. And there are two examples in the medical literature throughout history in the last 40 years where there was food poisoning as a result of consuming excessive amounts of lectins. In both cases, it was because they hadn't cooked the food. And in both cases, no one was actually hurt. They consumed too many lectins, they got acute food poisoning, and then they were back to work the next day. No one was hospitalized. So this sort of idea that lectins are so dangerous and threatening to us, well, if you cook your food, which quite simply when we're talking about legumes, it just means boiling them, or alternatively using a pressure cooker, but that's not even required. You can just boil them. You are removing the lectins. And you are removing them to a point that they are undetectable or completely inconsequential.
I mean, we're almost having the anti-fragile concept discussion here, because you can take this anti-fragile concept discussion and apply it to anywhere. It's like, if you are trying to avoid every little possible thing that might try to kill you, then you may as well be living in a bubble.
Right.
And it's the same thing. So
and then you would actually get more sick as a result.
Exactly. So the anti-fragile concept for me, it's like I do subscribe to a lot of that notion, even though sometimes it's extreme, but it's like you have to expose yourself to stress. And at even a military level, a lot of times you don't default to you don't default to the highest level of training. You default to the lowest level of training, right? You don't default to say, I'm going to rise to the occasion. You're going to default to your lowest level of training. And what that essentially means in a non-military application is even with our bodies, if we are constantly babying ourselves, that's like saying I'm going to make sure that I'm sanitizing my hands all the time. I'm washing my hands all the time. I don't want any because I don't want to get sick. It's my thought process with food too. I think you do need to, now hyperpalatable foods are a completely different situation, processed foods, different ballgame altogether. But as far as whole foods, you do need to, at least in moderation, expose yourself to these things so that you can develop the ability to deal with them, but build some resiliency. It's almost like training with a weight vest on. If lectins are mildly poisonous to us, but they are also naturally occurring in existence, and we have a perfectly capable ability to deal with them, then it would make sense that having them in moderation might actually make us more resilient humans. That's purely hypothetical, but it's sort of how I look at this whole thing.
Well, and I also think the dose makes the disease, right? So in the sense that you and I, we breathe oxygen, and we need oxygen to sustain our life, and without it, we would die. But actually, if you take a patient to the hospital, and I've done this at least hundreds of times, and they're in the intensive care unit, and you give them 100% oxygen, which, by the way, is necessary for some people who are extremely sick. That's actually toxic. 100% oxygen is actually toxic. Yet it's the thing that we need to survive and to live. Now, I'm not sitting here making the argument that we need lectins in order to live. That's not the argument. But when you take a little fractional baby dose of lectins, that's completely different than eating uncooked kidney beans. And that amount can have a different effect on your body. And the evidence actually suggests, Thomas, that low doses, these sort of microdosing of lectins that you get from consuming legumes, cooked lentils and whatnot, that it's not inflicting harm. If anything, it's actually protecting you. It's actually to your benefit. In fact, and I encourage the people who are watching this, go and check out PubMed. Go to PubMed, type in the word lectin, and see what pops up. And what you're going to see is a ton of studies that are talking about how lectins protect us from cancer. And that's because, once again, it's completely different when you consume lentils which have a small amount of lectins compared to something in a test tube where you're concentrating the lectins in isolation. That's completely unnatural. So, the last argument that I would really say with the lectins before we move on, because I have to say this, is like the fact that there are people who make the claim that lectins are responsible for all of our major diseases is comically sad to me. It is comically sad because do you know how much beans we consume on a yearly basis in the United States?
No.
6 pounds. 6 pounds. So if you were to take this and like average it out on a daily basis, I would be dropping a couple of beans onto your plate on a daily basis. That's it, right? That's a joke. There's no way that is what's inflicting harm on our body. You want to talk about sugar or a number of different things from our dietary perspective that are inflicting harm on our body, we can have that conversation, but don't tell me the thing that we're only eating 6 pounds of is our major problem.
And playing devil's advocate with even what I was saying on sort of, exposing yourself to a little bit of this sort of benign toxin in a way. I mean, people could have the same argument with alcohol, right? They say, okay, well, if that argument is true, then isn't it fine for me to have alcohol? And people probably know my stance, on alcohol. It's, I do not condone it really. But, in the newer literature that's coming out with alcohol, not to go on a tangent, but it's really suggesting that no amount of alcohol is really good. Like,
right.
We used to think, a little bit of alcohol is good, but it wasn't even because of the alcohol. It was the potential links with resveratrol and whatnot. But there is a difference between something that is a hard hepatotoxin, acetaldehyde, that is an actual liver toxin, versus something that is an anti-nutrient that our gut has the ability to essentially deal with. And I just want to put that out there because I know that comes up when you talk about that.
Well, no, I'm glad you brought that up, right? Because I think to present lectins as like, oh, well, they're toxic, but in a small dose, don't worry about them because in a small dose, they're not really going to hurt you. I think we have to reframe this, right? In a small dose, they're probably protecting you from cancer. And we have to look at the big picture. We have to zoom out and see the big picture here, which is that when we look at the healthiest populations across the globe, like look at the blue zones, right? What are they all eating? What is the common thread that ties all 5 blue zones, whether it be Okinawa or Costa Rica, Sardinia, Icaria, or here, Loma Linda? What is the food that ties them together? They're all in their own way consuming legumes, all of them. And so they're consuming their lectins. When we look at the data, when it comes to legumes, it's overwhelming. People who consume more legumes, they live longer, they're less likely to die of heart disease, they're less likely to die of cancer. To be completely honest with you, in the current climate that we have in today's society, Thomas, where we are overweight, obese, we are insulin resistant, our number 1 cause of death is heart disease, our number 2 cause is cancer, we need more fiber, our gut is starving and not doing well. If I were to give literally one food that I would suggest that people consume more of, it would literally be legumes, and I'm not kidding when I say that. And they're not expensive. They're dirt cheap, they can be added so easily to so many meals, and yet we're avoiding them. Why are we avoiding them? We shouldn't be avoiding them, we should be welcoming them, we should be embracing them.
Yeah, and unfortunately, sometimes it ends up in a discussion where if you talk about something such as legumes, they're going to assume that it's a plant-based agenda, and I say that directly because it's like I will get it if I talk about Mediterranean or I talk about even consuming legumes or consuming lentils. Sometimes I'll get that. Oh, they got to you, Thomas. They got to you. And the point is, and I want to make this very clear, is that it doesn't matter if you eat a dump truck full of meat. Adding these things in has benefit, and I think sometimes people get on the defense that says, well, no, I'm not going to eat that because that means I have to give up my ribeye. Look, I don't care what you and your ribeye do in the other room. Like, I don't care. Like, that's your problem. That's a different discussion for a different day.
Yeah.
And, whether it's going to be a dump truck full of chicken breast, ribeye, whatever, if you are adding these things in, I'm talking about using them additive, not necessarily substituting.
Yeah.
So talking about the addition of legumes, the addition of lentils, and as a potential starch source.
Right.
So much better than having rice as far as the glycemic load is concerned as well, and glycemic index. Not that I'm saying anything's bad with rice either, but being like, hey, if you have these options, why are we bashing a bean when it's clearly a more viable GI than white rice?
Right. I mean, I think that sort of defense against the legumes, I understand that it's like, well, I don't want to make that substitution, so I'm going to kind of go on the attack and try to find ways to say that this isn't necessary. And I'm completely here to say that you don't have to change your meat intake as far as I'm concerned. That's a personal choice. I mean, I do have feelings about that and a position on that, But ultimately, the average American in the United States right now, 60% of their calories comes from ultra-processed foods, right? Imagine what we could do if we would substitute out, like, so again, don't change the animal product intake at all. Let's just change that.
Yeah.
The 60% of ultra-processed foods. And they would save money by consuming more legumes. They would save money. They would be less sick. They would have a better energy balance. They would perform better in terms of their exercise. They would extend their longevity. And this comes from something that, like, it's available to all of us, no matter where you live.
No, it's been a big, no-brainer for me as I've kind of made a switch, from doing full-time low carb to kind of alternating kind of carb cycling in. Like, okay, I have two very clear directions that I can go. I can go this higher glycemic route, and I can, dose carbohydrates appropriately and try to manage that like some people do, or I can eat the carbohydrates that give me a little bit of flexibility and also give me some potentially added benefit, right? So it was a very easy decision for me to make. And personally, I didn't change my protein intake one bit. I didn't change my dairy intake. I didn't change my meat intake. All I did is replace what was, other forms of fat or what was other forms of carbohydrates and replace them with those more Mediterranean style carbohydrates. Yep. It's easy to slap a label on that because it can seem threatening at first, but when you realize that, hey, start thinking of it as a supplement. Think of it that way. I am supplementing these foods to try this additive component of it and how it changes how I feel. You don't need to identify with it. You don't need to make it who you are, but treat them almost as a supplement and see how much better you feel.
Yeah, it's like in politics, people have turned, religion into politics. Like, it's like you're religiously attached to that label of whatever your party is. And the same is now true in nutrition, which is that, like, we're applying labels to people. And I honestly think it's counterproductive. Like, let's forget the labels. Like, eat what you want to eat what makes you happy, but you know what? You should also care about your health. You should care about longevity and reducing your risk of these chronic diseases because, look, they're prevalent, they're everywhere.
Yeah, I agree, absolutely, man. So where can everyone find you?
So you can find me on social media, on Instagram and Facebook as The Gut Health MD. I'm on TikTok as The Gut Health MD _. And you can find my website is theplantfedgut.com. So come join me there. I got a great email list and a lot of fun things happening.
Right on. Thanks, brother.
Thanks, man.